Welcome to Oystermouth Castle. The castle you see today is not in its original state, but is a confection of styles culminating in a 21st century restoration based on a 19th century romantic idea. It was built nearly 1,000 years ago, has transformed many times, and has changed hands between numerous residents. We are going to take you on a journey through the ups and downs of the castle's colourful history, from the conflicts of the late medieval period to the legends of ghostly apparitions of its former resident. The first century of the castle was a very turbulent time, as it was also for the entire Gower region. When Gower was taken from the Welsh by Norman forces, Oystermouth Castle was built starting in 1107. The manor house, now called the South Keep, is the original masonry construction. A primary fortress built of earth and timber existed before the manor house, when it became occupied by the original resident, William de Londres, whose family also held nearby Ogmore Castle. Throughout this period, war raged between the Normans and the Welsh of Deheubarth. The castle was destroyed and rebuilt several times over. The occupation of the castle would also change hands frequently during this unstable time. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Welsh would win back the region, but only temporarily. During this period, much of the castle that can be seen today was not yet built. Designed for residential use, the original building, the manor house, is what we now know as the South Keep and Hall. When the Londres family died out in 1215, the castle was taken by the Welsh once more, but not for long. Once King Henry III took power in 1216, soon after the Welsh were driven out, and the barony of Gower was handed to John de Braos. The de Braos family held the castle throughout the 13th century. Passing from John de Braos to his son William, and to his son William de Braos III, who inherited the castle from his father in 1291. The same year his daughter Alina was born. The de Braos family made many additions to the castle. The North Keep was added in the early 13th century, along with a curtain wall, internal buildings and residential buildings being added by the mid-13th century. The keep is the strongest and safest place in the castle. First constructed by the de Londres family in the 12th century, William de Braos expanded the keep in the 13th century to include a northern room. The original area of the southern keep was used for lavish events and banquets held by the lord of the castle, and would have been used to entertain King Edward I during his visit in 1284. In the center wall is a large back-to-back fireplace would heat both areas of the keep. The northern area, constructed later, consists of a first-floor residence known as the Solar, sometimes referred to as the Great Chamber. This area was used by the lord and lady of the castle as a private domestic retreat. An additional building was added in later years to the northwest corner of the keep, comprising of vaulted basements, one containing a water tank. The other had a large masonry pillar, which is known as the whipping post. The castle was fortified and features were added for modern comfort of living, such as fireplaces and toilets on each floor. The castle would become the main residence of the de Braos family toward the end of the century.
My name is Alina de Braos. My father, William de Braos III, was Lord of Gower and came from a distinguished line of Norman barons. No one before or after him had such influence and owned such vast swathes of land. He was an able soldier, serving King Edward I in various wars throughout the 13th century. However, he inherited vast debts and soon had to find ways to dispose of these, selling off assets whenever he could. At the age of 7 years, I was betrothed to John de Mowbray, then aged 12 years, whose wardship was granted to my father William. This was to ensure that my father could sign over his land without any further consequence. John and my father signed a contract which recognised John's right of inheritance of the lordship of Gower. My husband supported the rebellion of the northern barons, led by Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, and cousin of King Edward II. However, after the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322, John was captured and executed, along with the Earl of Lancaster and other barons. After years of happy residence at the castle, my hopes to inherit the castle were dashed when my husband was condemned a traitor. I, along with my son, John II, was sent to the Tower of London, where I was imprisoned for 5 miserable years. When King Edward II was deposed, his son, Edward III, became king, and by an Act of Parliament and the magnanimity of the king, all of my estates were restored to me. The following year I married the knight Sir Richard de Peschel. I returned to Oystermouth Castle in 1327 and enhanced my private chapel.
The chapel consists of the living quarters on the first floor, with a chapel room above. We can still see the ornate architecture and decoration that made it one of the finest chapels of any castle in the region. The chapel marks the change in function of the castle from military to high-status residence. Finely cut limestone blocks, narrow pointed arched doorways, ornate ashlar window jambs and tracery with 2 pointed and cusped arches are quite typical forms of Gothic architecture. Another feature of the chapel tower is the piscina on the second floor in the south wall, with beautifully carved stone decorations. There are references in the chapel to painted decoration and murals depicting angels. Today, the visible remains are extremely faint, but there is still clear evidence that the decoration was highly elaborate, covering both recesses. These paintings confirm the high status of the chapel, also indicated by the high quality of the windows. In 1331, the de Breos family dies out with Alina, but their mark on the castle and its history would be left for centuries. Present-day visitors to the castle claim to have seen Alina's ghost, and has become known as the White Lady of Oystermouth. In recent years, ghost hunters and spiritual experts have been drawn to the castle to catch a glimpse of the White Lady. Maybe you will see her today. During the later 14th and 15th century, Oystermouth Castle would lose its strategic relevance in dominating Gower and Swansea Bay. During the 15th century, forces under Owain Glyndwr led an uprising in 1401 against the English overlords and occupied the castle, though it was soon retaken by the English. Over the next few centuries, the castle would fall into decay, despite a brief occupation during the English Civil War between 1642 and 1648. This included the blocking up of Gothic windows in the chapel tower and the addition of musket loops. By the time Oliver Cromwell was awarded lordship over Swansea and Gower, the castle was in a ruinous condition. The castle was partly restored during the 1840s and 1870s in the Romantic style. Popular at the time of viewing ruins as romantic mystical places by local businessman Lieutenant George Grant Francis, who was commissioned by the owner, the Duke of Beaufort. In 1927, Swansea Council bought the castle from the Duke of Beaufort. The castle was left to stand for many years. By 1989, the castle was open to the public. Over the next decade, the castle began to decay and areas had to be closed off. In 2002, the decision was made to conserve the castle, and in 2010, work began to restore various areas, stabilizing the existing buildings, adding a visitors center, and incorporating disabled access. Today, the castle is accessible to the public and draws tourists from all over the world to experience the rich history within these walls.